The collision, a moment where physics and miracle met in the desert sky. Imagine flying a fighter jet at nearly 500 miles per hour. You're 20,000 feet above the desert. The sky is clear. The engines are screaming behind you. The silence is absolute. And then, in a single instant, everything goes wrong because another aircraft has just slammed directly into you. Now imagine discovering later that half of your wing is gone, and yet somehow you are still flying. That sounds impossible. But in 1983, over the Negev Desert in Israel, it actually happened. And it remains one of the most unbelievable moments in aviation history. The aircraft involved was the F-15 Eagle. In the world of fighter jets, the F-15 has a legendary reputation. Designed during the Cold War, built for one purpose: absolute dominance in the air, twin engines powerful enough to push the jet past Mach 2. A thrust-to-weight ratio so strong the aircraft can practically climb vertically. Massive wings designed for high-G maneuvers. Pilots call it the king of the skies. By the early 1980s, the F-15 had already proven itself as one of the most capable fighters ever built. And on the 1st of May 1983, one of these aircraft took off for what should have been a completely routine training mission. The Israeli Air Force was running a dissimilar air combat exercise. In simple terms, it was a mock dogfight. F-15 Eagles acting as defenders and smaller A-4 Skyhawks acting as aggressors. The idea was simple: train pilots to fight aircraft that move differently from their own, make the exercise as realistic as possible. Push pilots to their limits. One of the F-15s was being flown by a young Israeli pilot named Zivi Nedevi. In the rear seat sat his instructor, Yehoar Gal. From the cockpit, the exercise was intense but controlled. Jets weaving across the desert sky, hard turns, high G-forces, pilots trying to gain the advantage. And then it happened. During one of the maneuvers, Nedevi's F-15 closed rapidly on an A-4 Skyhawk. The two aircraft were moving fast, very fast. In a dogfight, the margins for error are tiny, just a fraction of a second. Just a few meters, that's all it takes. And suddenly, the two aircraft collided. The Skyhawk was destroyed instantly. It disintegrated in mid-air. Its pilot ejected. But the F-15 was now in serious trouble. The collision had torn into the Eagle's right side. The aircraft began to roll violently. Then it entered a spin, a flat downward spiral toward the desert floor. Inside the cockpit, alarms were sounding. The jet was completely out of control. The instructor shouted the words every pilot knows: eject, eject, now. But something strange was happening. Even though the aircraft was spinning, the controls still felt slightly responsive. Not much, just enough. And in that moment, Nedevi made a decision that would become legendary. Instead of ejecting, he shouted one word back to his instructor: wait. And then he slammed the throttles forward. Both engines roared into full afterburner. The aircraft surged with power. Speed increased rapidly, and suddenly, the spin stopped. The F-15 stabilized. It was still flying. What nobody in the cockpit realized at that moment was just how badly damaged the aircraft really was. The truth was far more shocking than anyone could imagine. Half of the airplane was missing, and the hardest part of the story was still to come. When the F-15 stopped spinning, something unbelievable had already happened. A fighter jet that should have been uncontrollable, it was suddenly stable again. But inside the cockpit, the situation was still extremely dangerous. Fuel was pouring out of the aircraft. A massive cloud of vapor streamed behind them in the air. The instruments were behaving strangely. And the pilot and instructor were trying to understand what had just happened. From their perspective, the aircraft had suffered heavy damage, but they believed the wing was still there, just badly damaged. That assumption would turn out to be completely wrong, because what they could not see from the cockpit was that the entire right wing had been ripped off, completely gone. In fact, if they had known the truth at that moment, they probably would have ejected immediately, but they didn't know. And that lack of information may have saved their lives, because the F-15 was still flying. Now the next problem was obvious. They had to land. The nearest suitable runway was Ramon Air Base, and getting there would require flying an aircraft that technically should not even be able to stay in the air. But here is where the engineering of the F-15 played a critical role. The aircraft has a very wide, flat fuselage. And at high speed, that fuselage actually generates lift. Not as much as a wing, of course, but enough to help keep the aircraft airborne. At the same time, the two powerful engines of the F-15 produce enormous thrust. More thrust, in fact, than the weight of the aircraft itself. So Negev did something very unusual. He kept the aircraft extremely fast, much faster than normal. The speed forced air over the fuselage and the remaining wing. And that airflow created just enough lift to keep the jet stable. In effect, he was flying the aircraft more like a rocket than an airplane. Power was keeping the jet alive. But this solution created another problem: landing. A fighter jet normally lands at around 130 to 140 knots. But if Negev slowed the aircraft that much, the lift from the fuselage would disappear. The aircraft would roll toward the missing wing, and it would crash. So the only option was to land extremely fast, dangerously fast. As they approached Ramon Air Base, the crew prepared for a landing unlike anything the aircraft had ever attempted. The runway stretched out ahead of them. The jet was moving at nearly 260 knots, about 300 miles per hour, almost twice the normal landing speed. The aircraft touched down violently. The tires screamed against the runway. Smoke filled the air. The pilot deployed the tailhook to catch the arrestor cable, but the speed was so high the hook snapped off instantly. Now the aircraft was racing down the runway, still far too fast, still extremely unstable. Negev slammed the brakes, the wheels were glowing hot, the jet continued to slide forward. And finally, just 20 feet before the end of the runway, the aircraft stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. Two pilots sitting in a fighter jet that should not have survived the last 10 minutes. They shut down the engines, opened the canopy, and climbed out onto the runway. Neither of them yet realized what had really happened, but they were about to find out. And when they saw the aircraft behind them, they stood in stunned silence. When Negev stepped out of the cockpit and turned around, he froze. For several seconds, he didn't say anything, because what he saw behind him simply did not make sense. The entire right wing of the aircraft was missing. Not damaged, not partially torn, gone. The wing had been ripped away during the collision. What remained was a jagged metal stump where the wing root had once been attached. Ground crews gathered around the aircraft in disbelief. Engineers stared at the jet, trying to understand how it had stayed in the air. Because according to everything they knew about aerodynamics, it shouldn't have. Word of the incident quickly spread. Soon the story reached the aircraft's manufacturer in the United States, McDonnell Douglas, the company that had designed and built the F-15. When the engineers first heard the story, their reaction was immediate: impossible. According to their calculations, an F-15 missing an entire wing should roll uncontrollably and crash within seconds. There simply wasn't enough lift, there wasn't enough stability. It could not be done. But then they saw the photographs, the aircraft sitting on the runway in Israel. One wing completely gone, and yet somehow it had landed. The engineers flew to Israel to examine the aircraft themselves. What they discovered fascinated them. The F-15's wide fuselage had acted like a lifting body. At extremely high speed, the body of the aircraft itself had generated enough lift to stay airborne. Meanwhile, the massive power of the twin engines had allowed the pilot to maintain that speed. The aircraft had essentially been flying on raw thrust and fuselage lift alone. It was something the designers had never planned for, but somehow the aircraft had survived. The damaged jet was eventually transported to Tel Nof Air Base. A new wing was installed, and incredibly, the aircraft returned to active service. The same aircraft would later fly combat missions again. Years later, aviation students and engineers would study the incident as one of the most extraordinary examples of aircraft survivability ever recorded. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is this. The pilot himself later admitted something surprising. He said that if he had known the wing was completely gone, he would have ejected immediately, meaning the only reason the aircraft survived was because the crew didn't realize how badly damaged it really was. Sometimes in aviation, not knowing the full situation can be the difference between life and death. And that is the story of the F-15 that landed with only one wing, a moment when engineering brilliance, powerful engines, and one pilot's decision to keep flying combined to achieve something that experts once believed was impossible. Now the question is this: if modern fighter jets rely more and more on software and automation, would a pilot today still have the instinct to fight an aircraft like that? Or would the computer simply tell them to eject?